Thank you for being a friend. Travel down the road and back again. Your heart is true, you're a pal and a confidant. If you threw a party and invited everyone you knew, you would see the biggest gift would be from me, and the card attached would say, thank you for being a friend.
Mark Wingfield, thank you so much for coming on Beloved Journal.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Mark, you are a person who I have such respect for. You wear so many hats, and I hope we might discuss some of these hats today on the podcast. Currently, you're serving as executive director and publisher of Baptist News Global, after serving as 17 years as an associate pastor at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas. Now, Wilshire is not your typical Baptist church for those who might be listening. And Baptist News Global is not the typical church newsletter that people might be familiar with when they think of like church and news. Tell us about your work at Baptist News Global and the important work it's doing to help us be informed.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about BNG. One of the things I like to say now is that Baptist News Global isn't just for Baptists anymore. We have a really growing and diverse audience. More on that in just a moment. But we were founded as Associated Baptist Press in 1990 out of the schism in the Southern Baptist Convention. That's a whole long story, but in 1990, we were an entity that was providing news to state Baptist newspapers and to major daily newspapers as like a news service. But over time, with the growth of the internet and all the things that happened with the state Baptist newspapers and the SBC, we ended up being a direct to the consumer, direct to the reader service. So we are online only, nothing in print anymore, only online. And we've got tremendous growth going. We've been growing our readership base by about, I think in the past 3 years, we've grown about 40% in readership. So tremendous growth. And we're reaching a lot of folks who are not just cooperative Baptists or Southern Baptists or American Baptists, but also who are Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, a lot of non-denoms, and a lot of what I would call ex-evangelicals in the fold as well.
So with your work with that, you've covered events. I mean, you go on your website. I visit it regularly. I love the coverage that you have, and your team does such a good job. You've covered events from seminary presidents falling from grace to financial malpractice of pastors and seminaries. This is not easy stuff that you're talking about in any scenario or denomination. But it seems especially hard in a denomination like that of the Baptist Church, where there is such diversity of thought, opinion, understanding. You know, the old saying, the old story of the man on the island, and there's three buildings, and one's where he stayed, one where he went to church, and one's where he used to go to church. I mean, that's the Baptist.
Right.
That's the story, right? How do you maintain your journalistic impartiality while telling these stories that need to be told fairly? I mean, as a Baptist yourself, as a Baptist minister yourself, as someone who is distinctly a type of Baptist that is different from other types of Baptists, I mean, that could get complicated really quick.
Well, so 2 or 3 answers to that question. First, I was a Baptist journalist for 21 years before I was a pastor, and then 16 and a half, 17 years as a pastor. And when I came back to be a journalist unexpectedly, those years as a pastor have changed me, and I have a different perspective, a different understanding than I did before. But I still have that tough skin that I had before, and you just have to in this business. But that pastoral sensibility, I think, really has changed the way I see things and the way we present things. So we are not, ambulance chasers. We're not trying to be scandal ridden. The majority of our content is more uplifting. It's more data driven. We do a lot of research articles. We do a lot of analysis pieces trying to explain things. But one of the things that helps in this is so much of the difficult stuff we write about is larger cultural issues. it's not just a singular issue. So we're trying to interpret big issues about immigration and Christian nationalism and church life issues. And we do a lot on the SBC still because we have a lot of SBC folks who follow us, and that's sort of our background. And not being part of the SBC, I don't really have any skin in that game anymore, which creates some distance for that as well. But you just have to learn to be objective in this, and you can't expect people to like you in it. But my main thing is I want people to say we're fair. And so, the best compliment I get is I have several SBC pastors who write me regularly and say, uh, you're the only place we find out what's going. And so that's good. Uh, it's what we do.
I know there are times when I see a news story on Baptist News Global or on the Episcopal News Service or United Methodist Communications when I'm looking around because I don't have a life. Obviously, that's what I do is I look around on your websites, and there's times that I just want to get you all in a room and scream, not at you all, but at the ways that the situations that you're reporting on were mishandled or how people failed miserably at what they were doing in their jobs and their callings and their ministry. I'm curious, like, how do you keep your faith in God's work in the church when you're reporting on this stuff that can be so messy? And I know, as you said, you do report on the good stuff too, but there's times where you just probably want to hit your head against the wall.
Well, this is a tremendous question, and this business it's not deconstruction, it's faith breaking, because you are dealing constantly with the dark side of religion. It's just ever present every day in what we're doing. And it's easy to succumb to that. So this is the reason there are two other things I do to balance my life. And they work sometimes and not others. One is I continue to teach a Sunday school class at my church every Sunday that I've been teaching 24 years. That is most of the time, believe it or not, for a liberal like me, verse by verse biblical exposition. We just finished 1 year in the Gospel of John. It took us 1 year to get through the Gospel of John, verse by verse. The other thing that I do to maintain balance is I officiate funerals on the side, and I've written about this a good bit. But because I have flexibility in my schedule, I am on call for funeral homes here in Dallas. And when someone needs a minister to officiate a funeral because they don't have a church, they don't have a minister, I'm one of the people they call. And so last year I probably officiated 100 funerals. And these are almost always with not unchurched people, but what I call dechurched people. And I love that interaction. I'm interacting, as I recently wrote, with the nuns, the NONESs, every week. But I'm also keeping a hand in that pastoral ministry. And I think you would understand from your work too, staying close to death is a way to value life.
I would argue that give me, and it sounds so, people think I'm crazy, but give me 1,000 funerals over one wedding.
Oh, absolutely, hands down.
And you know what I mean by that.
Absolutely.
It's not that we don't love and celebrate the people
Right.
coming together, but there is something holy about commending someone to God. And I think, too, I really love, I actually do the same thing you do. And I love that some commonality there in helping out with the funeral homes, because people need that service, and it's not a
Yeah.
service that's easily rendered like at a wedding where you could just have someone, some people just have someone stand up there and read a few things. It's a lot harder to confront death head on and say,
Absolutely.
we actually know something more than what you know about what's going on. And that in and of itself, that's a powerful witness. I mean, that to me, that's the gospel right there.
Oh,
So
absolutely. And to me, it's a great counterweight to all the despair of the church, because you're reminded of what really matters. And you have to stand up over and over and over again before people and declare the gospel hope. And I got to listen to what I'm saying. And many times,
and believe it too.
well,
You-
that's the thing. I find myself asking, I'm standing at a graveside saying these things that sometimes in the back of my head, do I really believe this? I mean, do I really believe what I'm saying, or am I just saying words? And it is the most persistent challenge to my faith of anything that I do. And that's one of the reasons I do it.
It's like it's almost like exercise in a sense. You're exercising that, not you're giving practice to what you are preaching. Really, truly.
It is, and you have to
Uh,
think about it. I mean,
yeah.
you the other thing that doing funerals helps me with is it helps me choose life. Because there are multiple times in my journey where I run into obstacles that have been so depressing, so difficult that I have been one or two steps from being suicidal. And I've chosen repeatedly to live through that. And one of the reasons I do funerals is it reminds me how important life is.
Recognizing it's not all bad. I mean, you can't have all death. We, as
Right.
much as we'd like, we have to do some weddings sometimes. We have to do some stuff that is celebratory and good. Um, what are the stories that have given you hope recently that the Baptist News Global and you have reported on?
Well, yeah, I'm a little twisted. And so I find hope in some of the negative stories as well, because it is out of some of these negative stories that change can happen. It's admitting, owning up to some of the failings, some of the limitations that we can make changes and do something different. So even those stories, I think, give us hope. Really, the big thing that weighs on me as a person right now is the state of our country and this tremendous fight against Christian nationalism and Trumpism that is, I think, a spiritual battle as well as a political battle. And that's what keeps me up at night. And the thing I get most depressed about is the just the dumbfounding reality of where we find ourselves today in a place that I could have never imagined we would ever be.
I mean, I'm sure with this Christian nationalism reality that our nation is reckoning with, and that's, I think, the word reckoning. There is a reckoning with
Right.
this reality, right? Like there's something really going on here. I'm sure for you, when you get comments from people either on the Facebook pages or the social media warriors who are ready to
Right.
defend Donald Trump or Trumpism or Christian nationalism or the alt-right or whatever you want to call it, they want to defend this notion of a God that is not a God. Um, I'm sure the initial reaction is just to bite back, right? Like, I mean, that would be mine. I mean, I would just want to fight back, and you can't really do that as a journalist. You have to tell the story and you have to tell the truth. I think it's equally frustrating though that in telling the truth, you're accused of mishandling the truth of
Yeah.
what's really going on, of getting to the bottom of this, because you're reporting the facts as they are, and yet
Correct.
somehow you are the problem because you are telling a story that is contrary to the narrative that they are trying to tell. I'm sure that's just like a mind-boggling reality to deal with.
It is, but you also just have to learn to let it roll off because I get those emails every week. We get the social media comments, and you have to know when not to engage because you're just never going to win that battle. And we try to, put a word of hope out there when we can, give explanations when we can, but there is no, I've been around long enough to know there is no benefit in engaging a fight with someone who's that spun up about issues that are all out of whack. So,
Especially online. Like that's the place you want to
yeah,
have that argument, right? Is
I
like on
mean,
a,
there's times you want
behind
to
a
tie back,
keyboard. Yeah.
and defend something. I just let it roll.
Yeah.
Unless someone's challenging a factual error, which we will address factual errors, but if they just don't like what we published, or I get emails from people, why are you so negative about the Southern Baptist Convention all the time? Well, it's sometimes I'll respond if it looks like they really want a conversation, but I don't have time, and it's just too frustrating to engage people who are just haters.
Right. I mean, and in some ways, I hate to say it, not to bash the Southern Baptist Convention, whatever, but it seems like a lot of what they're doing is to themselves, and you're just reporting what happened. You're not making up, this grand. And in fairness, it appears that at least of late, there's been some Baptists on the progressive side that have had just as many problems as that of the Southern Baptist Convention. I mean, it
Well, I
seems,
mean,
you
yeah,
know,
those things are universal. But the SBC has done a spectacular job of,
I mean, yeah, they're the pioneers of that.
right.
So,
They're setting the bar really high, and it's sort of like being a traffic cop just sitting at a famous intersection. All you have to do is just be there at the right. I mean,
right, right,
these stories almost write themselves.
right.
Um, but there are a lot of Southern Baptist pastors and lay people who are thankful that we're telling those stories because the denominational news service isn't going to tell them. They're not going to tell them themselves.
Right, right, and you know, and that brings me to my portion of the interview that you wrote this book. It's a new book out called Honestly, Telling the Truth About the Bible and Ourselves, which we will link in the show notes for listeners who might want to read that. It seems like, I mean, like we're talking about it, all this fake news running around. How can we find truth in what God is doing in the world? How can we find God amidst that just cacophony of mess and nonsense? I mean, you know, it's hard to tune in because it's easier to tune out, right? And I think what I got from your book at least is there is some reason to cling to the truth right now.
Well, again, the book is essentially a Bible study with cultural commentary thrown in to it, right? The book began actually as a series of lessons in the Sunday school class I teach, and then I worked it over from there. But it goes through the Bible from beginning to end, discussing, the notion of biblical truth, uh, and then laying that against some of the issues that we're facing right now as well, telling the truth about race and immigration, telling the truth about women, and telling the truth about the Bible and creation and all these things. And so it has a biblical basis to it. It's, by the way, great for small group study as well. It's organized in that way. But yeah, this is, I think, the biggest issue of our present moment is the redefinition of truth. There are folks who are literally turning truth upside down to say that what's true is false and what's false is true. I mean, Donald Trump is the exhibit A. He's the poster child for this. He excels at it, but he's got lots of acolytes who are doing this as well. The funny thing is, just this morning, I was reading the latest briefing post from Al Mohler at Southern Seminary, and someone had asked him a question about media sources who you can trust. And he goes off with this long discourse against National Public Radio and the major networks and PBS and their alleged liberal bias there. But he also warns this person who's asked the question to be careful about these other outlets that have no sourcing and no authority and no authenticity. And I'm like, well, what are you left with? It's just not helpful. The truth is being trampled in magnificent ways right now.
I'm gonna pull a scriptural question for you then.
Yeah.
What is truth?
Well, the famous question of Pilate, as he's washing his hands, what is truth? This is the essence of this. And, I'm old enough to remember when Focus on the Family, James Dobson, Barna, and all these people were so fixated in the 80s and the 90s on something called absolute truth. There was all of this talk about absolute truth, and the Christians had these absolute truths that you had to believe. And what's hysterical and sad right now is that these same people no longer care about absolute truth. Uh, they've just flipped the script on what they said. And the reality, I think, is that the biblical text does have some truths that are transcendent, that are for all time, but also mixed in with that is a lot of historical stuff and contextual stuff. And part of what we're about in ministry in different forms is helping people understand the difference between that. So often I talk about the book of Revelation when people ask me about it. I've sworn I'll never teach from the book of Revelation again. And I'm not even sure it should be in the Bible, but it's there. And to me, the point of Revelation is God wins. The rest of it doesn't matter so much. You don't have to get down in the granular detail of the metaphors and symbolism of Revelation. God wins, and it gives us a word of hope. So there's something out of that. There is truth in Genesis that doesn't have to be a literal 6 day creation truth. It is the truth that God creates, that God loves. And we can get to these big pictures without having to drill down into what some people just need black and white, detailed scripts on every, they need charts and graphs and, you know, it, they need to parse everything down to the nth degree. And I just don't think that's what faith is about.
I think it's so interesting that we live in a world that is so consumed with truth, but so unwilling to tell it. If that makes
There's a
sense,
good line.
I mean, we live in a world that is so we have to be connected instantly and instantaneously to everything we need to know, yet we're not willing to source that which we want to know. Like Al Mohler. I mean, like you gotta get to the bottom of what I mean. If you read, I could write something online and you could publish it. And I'm thankful for what you published of mine, by the way, on Baptist News Global. But that said, there is some vetting. There is we all do this, and to assume that there is just basic, truth at the very insular level. I'm a big proponent of saying that the nuance is lost in our day and age. And I think that you do such a good job of helping us see the nuance in the story. And that's so desperately needed right now because nuance is a lost art.
So thank you for that. And I was having this conversation with a friend just last week who is in corporate communications for an entity, and he's got a staff of young writers who he's frustrated with because they think truth is giving direct quotes of what people have said. What they're lacking is the context of those quotes. I mean, you can quote the Bible, you can quote a politician, you can quote a preacher, and not understand the context in which they said that. And so part of good journalism is giving context that's not an opinion. It's just saying this is the context in which this was said, and this is why this matters, right? We can explain it in a way. And this is one of the big problems with all these people who have blogs and websites and call themselves journalists who really have no journalistic training today. And maybe they have a particular issue they're on or a campaign they're on or whatever. And so often I see them just presenting quotes of things, and it's always lacking context, and it's not objective in the right when they think they're being objective by sticking to just the facts, but objectivity requires interpretation, and that's counterintuitive.
Well, one of the things that we're asking every guest that's coming on this third season of Beloved Journal, I hope you might be willing to share with us in the search for truth and your search for journalistic excellence and your search for all you're doing, whether it's with your Sunday school class or writing books or telling stories that matter. I'm curious, what is the most beautiful thing you have ever seen or witnessed?
Oh, I've lived long enough that I could give multiple examples of that, but I'll tell you one of the things that recently has struck me is, as you know, I'm an ally for the transgender community, unexpectedly, unlikely. And of course, our church 7 years ago went through this tremendous 18-month study and voted to become fully inclusive. And we lost 300 people in a month. And it was so difficult. But 7 years later, what I'm seeing now at church is the beautiful rebirth of hope. And I see people coming to join the church who would not have been welcome in our church 7 years ago. I see people serving on our pastor search committee recently who would not have been able to serve on a pastor search committee 7 years ago. I see people being ordained as deacons today who would not have been able to be deacons 7 years ago. I see same-sex couples bringing their babies to be dedicated and to be welcomed into the church as a family. And I have a friend at church who just last year transitioned from male to female, and she chose the place to come out at church. It was one of the most remarkable Sundays I've ever seen in my life, and I was so full of emotion I could barely stay in the room. Her name is Chelsea, and she chose her coming out day to be the day she was featured in our church newsletter. We do a personality profile every week called I Am Wilshire, and she was featured that day, the first time she had been presented as her true self. And throughout the whole service, I was trying to find her. I was looking all around and I couldn't find her. But the reason I couldn't find her, she was sitting 2 rows behind me, and I don't have eyes in the back of my head, believe it or not. And when the service ended, everyone stood up, and I turned around and I saw her, ran to her, gave her a big hug, was so excited. She looked beautiful. And when I turned around after speaking to her, what I found was a line of people behind me who were coming up to introduce themselves to her. And she was able to say for the first time, "Hi, I'm Chelsea." And everyone welcomed her to the church. That was worth every pain we went through 7 years ago. It was a beautiful, beautiful moment. And she is a happy, healthy person who is excelling as her true self.
Well, I'm confident that not only Chelsea is a story of Wilshire, but there are plenty of stories. I have such respect for Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas and the work they're doing. Your church is in the process and continues to look more and more like the kingdom of God come near with each hire, with each person that you welcome into your fold, with each hug that you get. I mean, it's fabulous to see. All that's to say, Mark Wingfield of Baptist News Global, thank you so much for coming on Beloved Journal.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Beloved Journal is a podcast on a mission. Check out our other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast was hosted by the Reverend Rob Lee. Find him on Twitter at RobLee4 or on Instagram at RevRobLee. You can find our social media on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter by searching for Beloved Journal and finding our logo. Beloved Journal's theme music is a cover of the Golden Girls theme song done by Mipsa. Seriously, they're the best band in the world. This podcast was the dream of Stephanie Lee and was produced by Maggie the Golden Doodle and Frank the Poodle. Go show the world that it's worth fighting for. And as always, thanks for listening.